Hello everyone and welcome to today's Channelcast, Protect Your Clients from Multi-Vector Malware, sponsored by the Channel Company and Webroot. My name is Ed Hannon and I'm excited to be moderating today's Channelcast. First, to ensure you and the audience get the most from today's event, I have a few announcements and suggestions for you. First off, at any time you're free to ask questions of our presenters. You can submit those questions by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom left-hand corner of the console. If you're viewing this event on demand, you can still ask a question, and we'll be sure to follow up with you by email after the event. And later in today's program, we'll ask for your feedback. The presenters will advance the slides for you automatically, so you don't have to do anything except listen and take in the presentation. Again, you can also download a copy of the slides by clicking on the Files button, also located in the bottom left-hand corner of the console. And finally, if you have any technical problems, let us know by clicking on the Support button located in the top right-hand corner of the console. And as I said, my name is Ed Hannon, and I'm Content Marketing Manager with the Channel Company. And joining me today is George Anderson, Director of Product Marketing with Webroot. To learn more about George, click on the Speaker Info button. And I'll be turning it over to George in just a few moments, but before I do, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the world that we live in today and sort of the reality of cyber threats. And to be honest, we shouldn't even be calling them cyber threats at this point. They're happening so often and in such real time that they're real. They're part of the world we live in. You know, it's a reality. It's cyber reality, really. And you know, kind of like insurance, you put in place these cybersecurity measures thinking that you're not going to need them and kind of hoping you're not going to need them. But unfortunately, now you do. So what can you do? Well, one of the things that we've noticed, and I know George will talk some about this in a little bit, but one of the things is that, you know, in the world of the small business world, you really have to protect not only your livelihood but your customer's livelihood, because a small business, when it's hit with a cyber attack, goes right out of business. And that's what happens when your customers honestly see security as an expense and not an investment. It puts them at risk. And if you don't think, you know, that your customers are a good target because they're small, that's exactly what makes them a prime target. They're vulnerable, and they're often liquid. So it makes them very vulnerable to an attack and the sort of, you know, things that come from an attack. So what can you do? Well, you know, we've talked about how it's in the headlines and it's sort of reality these days. And you know, in the wake of WannaCry, for instance, a few months ago, we talked to some managed service providers about their key takeaways. And right at the top of the list was the importance of proactive security. And MSPs told us that proactive security really starts with an integrated and layered approach to security, you know, to protect those different levels of the environment. And that layered approach can include things like vulnerability management, patch management, strong protection technologies, and more. And you know, one solution provider told us his customers were up to date as a smaller percentage of them were running on older operating systems, but it also helps to make sure that adequate malware protections are in place when you're moving to the cloud. The key here is communication. You have to talk to your customers, find out where they're vulnerable or where their protections really aren't up to snuff. And again, you know, we can't stress enough the importance of layered security here. And a single approach is bad because, you know, if you think sort of a one-size-fits-all approach works, it really doesn't, and here's why. When a customer gets a phishing email, most vendors will offer a single point on how to stop the attack, and more folks are offering that one point where they stop it. But that's not a good idea. You deserve much more than that. And what I want to talk about here are some things that you should be talking sort of, you know, to your vendors about. And, you know, because today's cyber attacks are coming from so many different directions and so many vendors claim that they offer an adequate level of protection, these are some questions that we think here at CRN, and I would guess that George would agree with these are some things that you should be talking to your vendor about. And just listen to what they have to say, honestly. Do they offer your vendor a shield of protection? Does your vendor offer anti-phishing technology? Can your vendor identify problematic websites? And does your vendor offer journaling and rollback? And if you're not satisfied with the answers that you get from your vendor, you might want to reevaluate that relationship and think about whether or not that's the right vendor to work with going forward. And with that, I am going to turn it over to George. George, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Ed. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar. Protect your clients from multi-vector malware. Well, yes, malware is multi-vector, but it's really, this presentation, it's not long, and it's really intended to give you a view of why multi-vector protection is really essential to fully protect your clients and your users, and not just the devices that they use. So we're going to cover a bit of ground, some of it very briefly, some of it in a little bit more depth. So I've really split this into three parts. And the first part sort of looks at securing the connection, the user, and the device. And this is more about just general security layers. And it's only one slide. I'm not going to dwell very long on that. And then secondly, I'm going to mention one of the characteristics. I wanted to dive in a bit more detail into our identity and privacy shield, which is something we've had in the product since day one, and give you some idea about the sort of the layers that's going on, even just inside sort of, if you like, one sort of form of protection. And then I really want to take an example of multi-vector protection in action and try and give you an idea that, that especially endpoint security is as much about, if you like, prevention as it is about, if you like, protection, detection, and then handling the infection end of it. It's all of those things. It's a whole string of things you need that endpoint product to be doing. And I think with the sort of the nice new bright shiny toys out there, people are sort of getting a bit distracted into thinking, well, that next gen thing's going to do this and do that better. In fact, it probably does a lot of those prevention tasks a lot worse than even any traditional antivirus solution you can think of. And Webroot, we're a bit funny because we came in at a time and a period when next generation wasn't sort of mentioned at all in the marketplace, and of course we are a next generation solution, especially with our architecture and the way we work. No definition updates, all those sort of things. But really, again, we realized because of our background in supplying antivirus in the past to customers, because we did that since about 2002, that there was a lot of, you needed a lot of layers, and we protected a lot of consumers too. And an interesting stat, which I'm sort of going to be a bit boastful now, but I learned this week that we actually have moved to 90% of the retail market in the U.S. So if you go into one of those big box stores, which I won't name, 9 times out of 10 you'll walk out with Webroot. So I think when we started Webroot Secure Anywhere and initially launched that product in 2011, we had 6%. So it gives you some idea of how much traction our technology is gaining, not only in the consumer market in the U.S., but it also gives some indication of how things are going in the business market too. And there must be a reason for that, and hopefully these slides will sort of cover that. So let's go into something sort of a bit more general and just discuss a few areas and just talk about data protection, because I think in the end, all of this, we're doing all this security, we're doing it all to sort of to protect the data and to make sure we can use the data and use it for our business, and it's not being compromised in any way. So obviously access policy controls are something I think any good MSP or any good person managing their infrastructure is going to make sure that access controls are in place, and quite strict ones at that. And we know that ransomware tends to use those access policy things if they're weak to sort of jump around. So very key that that's sort of in place. Another thing I'm increasingly sort of persuading and trying to speak to people about is VPN technology, especially for roaming users and people that are out and about. The fact of having a VPN and avoid and be able to use, if you like, things like open Wi-Fi networks like you find in Starbucks or the airport or whatever safely is very important, because it's so easy for someone to actually intercept traffic at that layer. And often if you're in business, you're obviously doing work in the airport as well. So and even more complaints these days. I mean, I know United offer wireless in the air, etc. In fact, so a lot of them now. Another area which I sort of is something we sort of have to ourselves pay a bit more attention to as Webroot, I think in some ways as well, is a strong access authentication. There's a big move to really, accessing any access to the network has to be sort of more strictly controlled. And I think given what's going on, and as I mentioned, that speed and velocity of attacks and the different sort of methods that people are using. I think strong access authentication is another layer that's going to become increasingly important. And we're already seeing it in things like online banking. There's certain areas, obviously, that had it, but I think actually a more general usage of that within organizations is going to be seen too. Credential protection I'm going to cover a little bit in the next slide. And obviously I'd just go back to the old security basic of CIA. And that to me is more about looking at data against those criteria and then really planning for the worst case. I was actually on a call this morning with a backup and recovery company based out of Europe, discussing actually doing a webinar with them, and we're just saying I think people are going to constantly think now about planning for the worst case. What happens if this fails? What happens if this doesn't happen? Because again, because that speed, velocity, and sophistication of attacks now, it's you can't rely on one or two technologies. You've got to look at the whole different layers that you're doing. So let's talk about something something we've always had in the product, in fact, and something actually we sold to banks separately under a sort of different thing to protect people when they were doing their online banking. So a key thing you've got to think about, especially in the online world we live in today, is protecting users' credentials and their browser sessions when they're offline. So it's like securing that workspace for them, because it basically is a workspace you're talking about. So we introduced the Identity and Privacy Shield, which we actually had offered originally to consumers, but we offered it as part of our business product from day one, because we knew consumers needed to be protected, but we actually thought that business users just need to be protected just as much as consumers, and are liable to make the same mistakes and do the same things. It's also partly the reason why we're just about to introduce security awareness training as part of our overall offering to our MSPs as well, because that user thing is so key. But if you can do it automatically, and you can actually do it sort of technologically, then that helps too. So something like Identity Privacy Shield, that uses what we call kernel level lockdown. So it's the very lowest part of the OS, if you like, and it neutralizes things like phishing, DNS poisoning, keystroke logging, screen grabbing, cookie scraping, clipboard grabbing, all those sort of things which tend to be browser type vulnerabilities, and maybe even applications within the browser as well. And the clever thing about this technology is that if you want to protect, so it's normally used to protect the browser. So your whatever browser you happen to be using. If you're using Microsoft Edge, or still using IE, or using Chrome, or Firefox, whatever. But you can actually extend it if you want to protect applications as well. So you're able to actually say, well, actually, I want to protect Word in the same way as that. So it almost means that you start to operate applications within a bubble, if you like, to a certain extent. And protect them from sort of, even if there's an infection already on the actual particular device, it would actually cut out a lot of the things that say a keylogger could see. It wouldn't see anything, in fact, if it was working under the Identity and Privacy Shield. It does a lot of things. Obviously, it looks for online identity threats by analyzing the websites being browsed and detecting and blocking any sort of malicious content from those. It verifies a website user visits to determine if it's legitimate. We're analyzing IP addresses, see if there's been a redirection, if it's on our blacklist, for instance, so we have a lot of that. It verifies things like DNS and IP resolution, and again, with a DNS service, further out than the domain layer, which we also introduced this year, again about to do a major update with that, which is all about, stopping things out at that domain layer. So again, looking at a separate layer. If you can stop things at the internet layer before they even reach the network edge or sort of even approach the network, then you're going to cut out a lot of infections from before they even get started. So again, layers and vectors are sort of really the conversation today. And then you want to something to be able to stop untrusted programs, as I mentioned, from attacking protected data, things like screen scrapers and keyloggers. So the whole thing here is really that you're doing a lot of effort to protect the user in their day-to-day normal way of doing business. The risks are there. We know what the risks are. If you can prevent them and if you can protect them from those in the first place, that's a far better approach than letting something come down onto that device and then you're having to deal with it at that level. So I'm not the only one that thinks that. The analysts think that too. So this is actually from, I think it's there on the slide, it's Forrester's Endpoint Security Suites, Q4 2016. In fact, something we didn't appear in, I don't think. So for some strange reason, those things happen. So they talk about prevention, detection, and remediation. And if you look at Gartner and the Endpoint Protection Quadrant, which we do participate in, they will talk about predict, prevent, and detect as well. So that prediction part. And I think prediction is also part of that. We do a lot of prediction work with well, I'll explain a little bit later, but when we're seeing a file downloaded, if we can use from partial bits of the file, we can decide whether that's malicious or not. So it's actually predicting the likelihood of it being malicious only from partial information, if you like. So, I mean, I don't normally, SMBs and analysts, yes, the analysts tend to, serve the enterprise market very well, but I think this is actually a very good explanation about, what you should be looking for in endpoint security. And I mean, Ed was saying earlier about things to ask for. I think this is probably, if you start to ask around these, talk about what they do around prediction, what they do around prevention, detection, and then what they do about the remediation part. There was a little bit the journaling and rollback that was mentioned, but it's that containing the attack and be able to then, remediate back. And they've got vulnerability remediation there, which is slightly different. That's more your patch management and things like that, which very much sort of thing applied with WannaCry, etc. I think it was also, to probably step out of line here and step off script a little bit about Equifax as well, and their lack of patching, and also their use of sort of very weak passwords and things like that. Which I think in Brazil they were using admin and admin for some of their servers. I mean, really that should not be happening in an organization that's entrusted with everybody's most sensitive data like social security numbers, and we could go on. Anyway, I'm going to that subject because it just takes us down a dark hole and makes me very depressed actually about what goes on in certain sectors. So protecting the device, very key, and this is a very good way to go about it. So I'm going to flick a little bit on subjects, and I'm going to start to say, illustrate how we work, and maybe hopefully give you ideas about asking again the right questions when you're speaking to other or any vendor about the solution you're using, or even looking at the one you're using currently. So I think the stat that sort of stood out, there's a lot of stats that sort of stood out in the past 12 months, and the industry's, there's a lot of things going on, but the Verizon data breach report, which is pretty much a neutral report. It's not done by a vendor. It's Verizon going out and speaking to customers and saying, where you breached, how often were you breached, how were you breached, etc. And has got increasing participation since its launch, which was a few years back now. The statistic they came up was that phishing was behind 90% of security incidents and breaches in 2016. And we know phishing continues, and we're going to have a phishing simulator. In fact, I think the beta, if you want to go on a beta program at the moment with our security awareness training, we give you a phishing simulator and we let you sort of play with that and phishing. Phishing is obviously very key. It's not the only problem, but it's obviously, as you can see from this stat, a major problem. On the other side of the coin is just talking about malware generally, and within looking at infections and the attempts to make infections with with our own customers and customer base, we found and looked at that like 94% of all malware is unique to that single endpoint, to that single device. I put traditional signatures are useless, and I'm just really making the point is that the old idea, the way AV worked was you obviously had a definition database full of signatures, and you had it there, and if you matched the signature, then it was bad, and you could do that, at a certain rate, time of deployment, if you like. But I mean, almost since 2007, the last 10 years, that has got worse and worse at sort of performing and doing that, and I still see that hanging on in some products, and it really sort of irritates me. I mean, there is no definition database that's ever going to be up to date in an environment where 94% of things are completely unique. There's just no way. So don't labor that point too much, but obviously, again, it's looking at the technology behind the vendors you're using and saying, how relevant is this? Because actually, there's a lot of work with signature and definition files and keeping them up to date. There's a lot of effort, and it's obviously, in my view, a completely wasted effort because of the effectiveness it provides. But we'll leave that alone too. I'm not here to sort of knock other people. So let's just look at the multi-vector thing in a little bit more detail and how that happens. And really, if you look at how people get infected and what happens on devices, there's really a whole lot of there's an attack vector stage, there's then the payload delivery stage, and there's an infection and remediation stage, if you like. So obviously, the attack stage is you get an email, you're on a web browser, and you get malvertising display ads. You click on a hyperlink. There's files you're downloading. There's the social media apps, so there's applications coming into it as well. You've got external devices like a DVD, a USB, or any of those, or Bluetooth. In fact, you can get a whole lot of different attack vectors that could possibly infect a device and introduce malware into it. And obviously, at that stage, there's a whole lot of I mentioned the identity and privacy shield. I mean, there's the bottom of that slide, if you look underneath each heading, there's some of the shields that we have in place for that. And there's obviously the payload itself. So that could be adware, ransomware, spyware, it's keyloggers, viruses, trojans, worms. There's a whole raft of different ways, and also usually blends of those ways that those things can get on the device. And one thing to think of, I mean, I know ransomware, everybody goes, we're all still focused on that because of just the consequences of it. But I think what people often forget is that, ransomware rarely comes down on its own these days. There's often other attacks going on at the same time. So it's just not simply a ransomware attack. It's also there's some attacks being staged maybe for the future and for future things. And I was reading a very worrying article about this week about, we discussed about backup and business continuity. And I mean, we sort of saw it with Karanja, which was like the Mac attack originally, the first bit of Mac ransomware, where it sort of waited for 90 days for the backups to be to infect every single backup for 90 days, but not doing anything. So it knew that Mac didn't actually back up for longer than that. So therefore they could then charge the ransom. So like waiting 90 days to attack, if you like. And there's some of those things going on now about things hopping onto systems and staying there silently and letting backups continue for quite a long time before something happens. And it starts to make it really difficult then, because the whole idea about recovering from ransomware is because you can recover your files very rapidly, and they're fairly current files. But if you're scrambling everything going back a long period of time, then the damage obviously is different. So ransomware is adapting to the defenses we put in place, and that's something to think about a little bit as well, and maybe worry about a little bit as well if you haven't got the right things in place. Infection remediation stage is a little bit different. As I said, I've got a statement there. No one can prevent 100% of infections. I think anybody that says that to you should be put against the wall and quietly shot. It might be true that day, and it might be true the following day. But if somebody's taking their software and testing against it, they'll find a way around it, and that 100% will not stay 100% forever. So, as I said, it's very much better to plan for the worst. I mean, obviously, a vendor like ourselves, we're constantly trying to create that 100% protection, but it's hard work to keep it where it is. And in fact, I'm going to discuss that a little bit later in the presentation. So again, a number of technologies there. So let's take a look at that phishing scenario, because I think it's a great way of sort of being able to describe multi-vector protection and give you some sort of handle on that. So the attack stage, obviously an email comes in, you see a phishing email, very common. There's a whole lot of different ways that happens, and there's lots of different methods for that, but it's a very common initial stage. The user clicks on the link. But it might be a word attachment. In fact, I've seen lots of word attachments that are completely benign, actually. You open the attachment itself's got nothing in it at all, but you click something in, executable or a script inside the document itself, because documents can have scripts in them, and then the trouble begins, if you like. Obviously, if it's a web browser and you're at that stage, and then you're starting, then the payload, if it's coming down and obviously takes them to a malicious site or fools them into doing something, or social engineers them into doing something there, because phishing can do a whole lot of different things depending on how it's been aimed and how it's targeted. So let's look how we sort of would counter that, and I'm just trying to discuss some of those defense steps. So we've got something called a web threat shield. Very simply, at least uses our Bright Cloud Threat Intelligence. It just immediately looks at the reputation and the categorization of that website and decides then and there whether that could potentially be a phishing site or not. Works very well at cutting out some of the phishing attacks, but is obviously not a complete answer to that. So we're left with a period of doubt. We end up scoring, if you like, that link and what's going on there. And if we're not happy with the score we receive from that, then we tend to go into a second level of defense, which is our real-time anti-phishing. Interesting that, again, uses machine learning. Again, it's very much real-time. It's actually almost, if you like, and at the same time as the user's going there, it's interceding, it's going to that site on their behalf, and it's performing a whole lot of tests, over 200 behavioral and tests. In fact, I think it's a little bit more than that now. But the whole idea there is to determine with a very, very high degree of accuracy whether that is a phishing site or not, and whether the user is being spoofed. And as I said, it's an intercision thing. It's something that's going on without the user necessarily knowing it's going on. There's maybe a little bit of a delay, a little bit more latency than normal in them reaching that web page because of that. But we're talking milliseconds. We're not talking something that people would really notice. But the whole idea with that is that it's doing those checks. We're not the only ones offering that now. I think we were the first person to ever offer that within an endpoint product. I believe, and I did read an article about a month ago, that Google, again, using a very similar approach, machine learning, AI, etc., all those great things, and their data as well, are able to do that, and they're doing that on their Gmail service and starting to offer a real-time anti-phishing service on their Gmail service. Actually, this service we actually developed in association with another company to protect high net worth individuals who are being spear-phished all the time. So the only way if they're being spear-phished, obviously there's a lot of information. They're going to click on the link because basically it looks like coming from somebody they know. It's very well researched. You have to have something that there's no way, if you like, even to train the human being to not click on it, if you like, unless they're super paranoid. So that almost takes usage away if you do that. So this service came in. So between those two things, if we go back to that phishing scenario that we've seen this year with like 90% of breaches coming through that, we will cut out about 99% of phishing attacks just using those two shields in combination. Because we're able to identify, if it's a CNC site or whatever's in the background, we're able to identify it's a spoof phishing site, etc. Another thing that's going on is the attackers obviously using lots of domains and different domain names and IPs, etc. So, white and blacklisting is not a very effective way of doing this as well, and that's a lot of vendors still rely on that technology. And why it's useful, and it's good for sort of like a quick sanity check, if you like, part of the process. It's by no way an answer. So the user at this time, okay, as I said, 99% is pretty good, but it's not 100%. So we've got 1%. So we're going on to that sort of next stage, the delivery stage, and what's happening there. And this is part of that I described, that predictive side of it. The real-time shield we have is really a way of very quickly checking whether some of the file characteristics we're starting to see with that download, because something is obviously coming down at that stage, is anything we've known in the past as being known good or known bad. So we're doing a judgment call on that about if we know what that file actually is. So obviously with a collective threat intelligence, it helps. We see things pretty quickly, and if somebody repeats something, it's picked up almost instantly. But as I mentioned earlier, 94% of malware is pretty much unique to that individual on that device. So even then, things get through. So I think I'll give you the stat later, but I think it was something like 1 in 40 of all files and processes we saw sort of being downloaded last year were actually malware. So it gives you some idea of the ratio on what's going on. I mean, the real-time shield is a very, very quick process to basically say, is this something? Is it known good, known bad, and decide on that and predict whether it's going to be, to a certain extent, whether it's going to be bad before we actually get the full payload down onto the machine, because you don't have to deal with it at that stage. So obviously you reach the website, down comes the payload's coming down, if you like, and then we go into all sort of our big machine learning, all the sort of like heavy lifting processing we do around detecting malware, what's going on in the machine, the agent feeding back to the cloud what's going on, and us able to, if you like, even though I would always say you're almost in an infected state in such way, in that sense, but we're sort of managing that, containing it. As I said, we have a very unique way of doing that, and that's sort of expressed by, I'm going to discuss our efficacy, our ability to stop malware a little bit later on, and you'll see it's sort of a very different sort of way of describing that than any other vendor would actually use to describe that. Good thing about Behavior Shield is we can, as I said, we can look at those behaviors, see what's going on, and again, it's usually a very rapid way of being able to decide whether something's malicious or not. And if we're turning on the Behavior Shield, we're also turning on, I very kindly mentioned journaling and rollback. That's, I think, a patented technology of ours. So I'm not sure if other people have got journaling and rollback as such. I know other vendors, I know Kaspersky have got a sort of like an outside thing to do remediation, and I know some of the other vendors are, I think SentinelOne or something is starting to build remediation in as well. But basically it's an ability to be able to see what's going on, and if something's malicious, then basically you are able to remediate it. So at that stage, we've got auto remediation, but you might have moved into sort of almost like an infected contained stage for a while. And the reason we do that is because we want to be absolutely certain that if we classify something as being malicious and malware, it actually is malicious and malware. The last thing you want is false positives, having to constantly go back and sort of like fine-tune your system to cope with the different sort of attacks and vectors that come in. You want to be able to, we actually do that. We do that work, if you like, on the fly rather than having to try and tune things, if you like, at some other time. So again, different vendors working different ways and offering different things. But the auto remediation is very good because obviously one of the big costs that we all face is that if you've got a machine that's down, you've got to take the machine away from the user, then you've got to give them some other machine. There's some lost productivity there, obviously. And then you've got to rebuild that machine, reimage it, and give it back. So it sort of avoids a lot of that reimaging type work and cost that you would normally associate, and a lot of the productivity loss you'd associate with, if you like, a machine getting infected in the first place. I mentioned, I think I mentioned too about single vector protection. It tends to come in at one stage. Usually, when the payload's downloading as it's coming in there. And obviously, if you're not protecting the user and you're just protecting the device and you're just protecting that against malware, then it's quite a limited approach in some ways. And obviously, all the payloads are going to come to the machine in the first place. So your preventative technologies and what you do before things actually start arriving on the device, I think is the sort of question you want to be asking your vendor very much about what they do in that area as well. So I did say I'd mention how well we stop malware. We average out, if you go right to the right, about 99.7%. It's actually slightly higher than that, but we consistently do 99.7 sort of plus. So that's, I think, as far as the industry goes, I think that's a very high rate. And as I said, we never ever claim 100%. We do vary up from that, but we very rarely go. I think we very rarely go below that at all. As I said, 1 in 40, that's 2.5% of all new executable files we saw as malware. We stop about 85% of those or so instantly. Of the remainder that's left, so if you like that 15%, 56% of those we sort of deal with within an hour. And as I said, this is starting into a conversation that would be very different with any other vendor because most vendors, they have to make the decision when that majority stopped instantly. That's the only place they're doing it. In fact, I don't know any other vendor that actually has any dwell time capability or containment capability at all. They basically have to make the decision pretty instantly then and there, is this malicious or not? And I think that one of the secrets behind our success has been, and why we've been so successful, is that we actually give ourselves time to decide that. If we can't absolutely decide that, we give ourselves time to do that, and we give ourselves a capability of protecting the system and the user at the same time while we're taking that time. So it's, as I said, a very different sort of approach. 90% of that remainder, so 9% of the 15% after 12 hours, and pretty much after 24 hours, that's not 99.7%. So we accept, if you like, I think unlike other vendors, we accept the fact that a device might be infected for a period of time, but at the same time it's contained and nothing, data's not being exfiltrated. There's no sort of actually danger to the organization or the device or the user at that stage, even though the machine technically is infected. Very different. So another thing, I did mention false positives earlier, and this is just a way of describing that, how well we classify malware, and I think that's very, very key as well, because I think, again, with a lot of the next generation approaches, including our own, where you're using machine learning and AI and artificial intelligence, or whatever you want to get, there's lots of buzzwords bandied around. But when you're using big data and all those things to sort of decide, and try and get an accuracy into, if you like, into classifying malware in the first place, this actually looks across not only actually our endpoint stuff, it actually looks across all malware against all the bright cloud services and everything else we do. You're classifying and scoring, etc. And I think the thing to look at is the false positive rate there. You want that, keep that as close as possible to that 1, which is almost like a 0, if you like, score, and virtually 0. And you can see there there's some small overlap between the count and the classification there between the turquoise and the red. You see there's an overlap there. But you see it's the overlap at 0.0 that you're really concerned about. So that's false positives, false negatives, so you want to look at it that way. So that's programs which you could classify as bad, which are good, and conversely, bad programs classifying as good. So it's just both sides of the coin. I'm not sure if that made sense there, but I hope it did. So anyway, we classify. It just really this illustrates that we classify extremely well. So good. I've done covered a little things to look at, things to go. Where should we really sort of conclude out of all this? What should we take away from that? Really, you should be looking at technology that tries to stop attacks before an infection gets there or can execute. So whether that's using the DNS layer, I think that protecting the DNS layer is being attacked. A lot of people don't understand a lot about DNS. They think it's just a URL filtering type thing, but it's not. DNS is actually the address system for the internet. You need to protect. People are actually attacking that DNS layer to attack organizations, and it's a very quick way of stopping an organization having internet access and a whole lot of other things. So it's used in different ways. I mean, maybe enterprises see it more than SMBs, but nonetheless, it's something you need to protect. So stopping things at different layers. We have to stop things way away from the networks, is a good idea, but stopping an infection before it executes is absolutely there. This velocity, variety, and success rate of attacks is just really the only way to be able to fight that is to have multiple layers to actually defend against it. If you're relying on just a few layers, then you're not going to succeed. You're going to fail, and you're going to be hit by things. So you got to think very carefully about what is adequate and what is right for the organization you're protecting, and that data and where that data resides. Even if that data needs to be connected to the internet at all, is maybe a fundamental thing. And different levels of network, network partitioning and onion ringing of networks is a quite common technique too. So just to think about it a little bit more deeply than, well, here's my technology stack and this is what I'm going to provide to this customer. I think understanding a lot more about the customer's environment is going to be very helpful there. Obviously, you need to secure the online part, the connectivity, the identity and privacy protection, and have some real-time prevention there. So that's more back harking onto the things like the VPN, the secure access, the strong authentication, things like that. And then finally, I say, look, try and look for technology that secures both the user and the device. The user is the weakest link. As I said, we're investing heavily in security awareness training now. It's going to be integrated into our endpoint offering and console, so it can be used from there. Because we've seen that basically the user is becoming more and more the front line, especially if you think 90% of attacks are phishing. Then users are completely the front line, and they need to be protected from phishing. But not only that, there's a lot of other things, security awareness and education and training that's needed, also on a continuous basis, not just a one-off basis, to ensure that your people call it the human firewall is actually up to doing what it's doing, and to protect the organization too, because the attacks are so good these days that even security professionals, if they're not completely aware, can be fooled and can be drawn into those things. And I think that's something we should remember. I mean, they say only the paranoid survive, but we don't want to all live and being paranoid. So it's just that nice balance is achieved through the security awareness stuff. So that's it, really. I'm finished. Ed, I'll throw it back over to you for questions and see what the audience.
Awesome. Thanks, George. Yeah, thanks a lot. So before I get to the question and answer portion, George always gives us so much to think about when he comes on, and I have to thank him for doing that. And if you're sort of like me and you're sort of trying to collect your thoughts about getting some questions together, I should let you know that if you do have any questions at all, go ahead and type those into the Q&A box on the left of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can here in the time we have left. And if we don't get to them today, we'll follow up with you by email. But for starters, we had some that came in early on, so I'll sort of run through those, and then we'll just sort of keep chipping away here. But George, first off, how important is user education?
I think the funny thing is it's been piloted a lot. I mean, I think the thing is, large companies have sort of obviously invested in it earlier than small and medium-sized businesses. It's been expensive for them to do it, and it's necessarily been very accessible. So, but large companies have piloted this mainly since almost in the mid-2000s. So there's a lot of evidence that if you do, and I'm not talking about one-off education. I'm talking about if you do proper security awareness education, and you can make that relevant to the organization and the individual and to what's actually happening in the marketplace at the same time. And that's partly, I think, the reason why we were so interested in doing it, because we obviously see lots of threats. We see what's going on. So we think that relevance thing is very good. We also can partly see what's happening, I suppose, around at the individual level too. So we think it's very vital. It's effective. It cuts down it cuts down the percentage of people. If you had 15% of your people, for instance, clicking on phishing, it'll take it down to sort of like 1 or 2%. So if you imagine you're losing that, it's quite a large drop off. But there's a whole, phishing's only one thing. It's password, change people on password awareness, what sort of passwords to use, why they need to use them that way. There's a whole ton of different areas within IT security that you can give people education and security awareness. So to me, it was a nice to have. I would that would be the way I would describe it. I mean, I think a lot of us paid lip service to that. It depends what sector you're in. Of course, if you're in finance, you got to do PCI. If you're in health, you have to do HIPAA compliance. So there's a compliancy aspect as well, if you like, when you go into that. So that's sort of like taken. But general security awareness, in addition to that, is I think is if you start to combine that and have sort of continuous programs, and it's easy for you to do it and easy to make it happen, and you can make it relevant, and I think it's these days it's almost a necessity. I think it's just gone the other way.
Awesome. So one of the questions that came in while you were presenting was, can you scan for and delete rootkits and keyloggers?
The answer is yes. I mean, in fact, funny enough, the original technology that we built, Webroot Secure Anywhere, was a company called Prevex. There was a UK-based company we bought, which was part of the foundation of Webroot Secure Anywhere. And actually, what Prevex were really well known for at the time was actually their ability to identify rootkits. I think they were one of the first companies actually to identify rootkits and find ways of removing them as well. So a little bit of a claim to fame there. So obviously it's almost in the genesis of the product, to be honest with you, to do that. And keylogs are the same. We know what keyloggers are. We know what they look like. A keylogger would just be for us, a file. If we saw a file behaving in a keylogging way, we're going to stop that down, and we're going to stop it and roll the machine back and get rid of it. So yes to both of those.
Excellent. And is an RTF document still safe without scripts?
Anything that can run anything. If it's got, I don't think RTF can run macros or scripts. So in theory, but on the other hand, if it's got a link in it and you could link out somewhere, and it's, if you could link to something else, then you're going to be in a problem. But I think rich text format, I think is quite fundamental. So I wouldn't say definitively yes, but as far as I know, definitively yes. But as I said, I'm not 100% sure on that. I'm like 99% sure on that.
Okay. Here's another one. What suggestions could you give with web-based programs, mainly banking software, I think is how this is worded, that do not work with the ID shield enabled?
Well, if it's an exe file, you can actually obviously, if you're using our product, you can actually make the ID and privacy shield work with that exe program. So every time the user executes it, it goes into that same state. So it goes into that almost like protective bubble, and so it separates it from what's actually going on in the rest of that OS and that system. So you can do it that way. I mean, what we did to discuss what we did with the banking customers we had was actually we gave them sort of set pieces of that ID and privacy shield. So actually, when the user went online, before they actually could start their session, we locked them in that. So it was like we actually pushed it down transparently to the user. So in fact, that product's still in use and still in use by quite a few major banks worldwide. It's not to tell which ones, but we still do that. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but yeah, I mean, if you were using the product, you could put the application inside it. I think if you're not using our product and you have something else there, you'd have to look at, is there any other way you can isolate that application from being interfered? Does your current product give you some isolation capability? Do you put it into a virtual session, which is another, a lot of people use virtualization to sort of try and produce things out, but it's how you enable that and make that easy for the user is the key thing. So there's a number of different approaches to doing that, but you have to look at it. I mean, again, just making sure that you build as much defense around it as possible is what I'd say that you have. I mean, secure authentication, things like that.
Okay. Here's another one. If you have, or when you have Webroot Secure Anywhere Endpoint Protection, is it wise to add DNS Protection as well?
Yeah, because I think and it's really, I tell you something, I feel terrible. I'm the product marketing director for the company, and I obviously helped launch our DNS protection, and we sort of focus very much on sort of the malware and the URL filtering part of it, and I think really, in some ways, missed the point. And the real point is that DNS, it's there. It's something that's been part of the internet since 1985, whatever it is. It's the address book, it's the thing that does the translation. And DNS servers, you go to DNS servers, and every time you access the internet, use anything on the internet, it goes through DNS in some way or another. And the DNS service usually set out your ISP. And you would sort of think, well, they would protect that, wouldn't they? Well, in fact, they don't. I mean, pretty much they're left unsecured. So a lot of, especially larger organizations, are caught onto the fact that, one, they're unsecured, and two, they can be used, you can attack DNS. You can shut someone's internet connectivity down. It's supposed to be the worst thing to do, but you can actually launch attacks through DNS as well. So, one of the great benefits of securing DNS is nothing to do with the fact that you're going to stop user malware coming down. You're able to, control people's access to the internet, and you're able to do that in a way that they can't fiddle with. They can't change anything on the machine because it's all done obviously out in the cloud. So to me, the primary benefit in the first place is you're cutting off you're cutting off all those DNS attack vectors by going into sort of like a DNS type service, and you're also securing that connection to the internet, because obviously any DNS service, cloud-based stuff, we replicate that all over the internet in different parts of the globe. So, even if one of our clusters or one of our things went down, you would be able to still get to the internet through other ways. So the ability for somebody to attack an organization and close them down is limited as well. And that availability is always there for that organization and the resolution of their addresses. So I think it's understanding it at that level first that this is something you should do anyway just to protect your infrastructure. Then, hey, there's the added benefits of you're going to stop a lot of malware coming down in the first place, which means the endpoint doesn't have to deal with it. Your network defense, if you're a gateway AV, your UTM, whatever, doesn't have to deal with it. You're getting as clean as possible, pipe from your user activity coming into your organization. And at the same time, you're starting to get complete visibility, actually, of where those people are going. And then you can make decisions. You can make sensible decisions about, well, actually, I'm not going to allow streaming malware during business hours because it's eating up too much bandwidth. Or these people are using a lot of streaming malware. Okay, that's the marketing department. I can see why they're doing it, but I can't see why Fred in accounts is doing it. And so it's that visibility lets you start to set very sensible policies about how the internet's used and manage and control that. And of course, by doing that, you're cutting down your risks as well, and all sorts of risks, productivity risks, malware risks, compliance risks, across a whole gamut of things. There's different ways of doing that. DNS is not the only way to do it, but at least the thing about DNS, it's just really, really quick and easy to set up. I mean, something you can set up literally in a couple of minutes, and it's a very, very quick and easy way of doing that, and it's also a very quick way of giving that visibility back to the customer and saying, this is why we're doing this, because you can see what's going on, and this is. But that complete argument, I don't think we made as well when we first launched the product. We're making it a little bit more now as we move into our agent release and move into that area, but we didn't before.
Okay.
I hope that.
So let me ask you this. Yeah, that's okay. I don't want to cut you off, but I wanted to make sure we got to. There's a couple more here, and I want to make sure we get to them before we have to go. Cool. I really like this first one because I think it applies to everybody, even people who aren't listening to this. The people who are listening to this should tell their friends because this is a really good question. How can you significantly reduce the malware that users receive when they're working online?
Yeah, well, I think as I said, it's a combination of different things. I mean, obviously, if you do a DNS, you can cut up to 90% of user malware just by doing stuff at the DNS layer. So users are going out there. If you can then see where they're going and say, well, okay, I know that's a blacklisted domain, or I know that's I think we're lucky. I mean, Webroot are lucky in the sense we have got something called Bright Cloud Threat Intelligence Services. There are a whole range of things that we actually OEM that technology. We OEM that threat intelligence to the network and security industry. We have like 50, pretty much, you can name the network and security vendor, and we'll supply them with some form of threat intelligence. That, for us, is it's great for them, but the real reason that they buy that and actually buy that technology from us is the fact that we are able to very, very quickly correlate and contextualize different bits of new threat intelligence information we're seeing fed back from them, if you like, as well, about what their customer is doing. And we're able to grind that, if you like, and make it actionable in a very, very short period of time. It's one of we developed obviously that system for Endpoint in the first place, but it's obviously the machine learning. In fact, come from different sources, but we sort of expanded that out to do that job extremely well and very accurately and very timely. So So that ability to be able to look at what people are doing and analyze their traffic very quickly and decide, whether that's has got a risk factor and what that risk factor is very key in cutting down things. So, not us, but there's other DNS solutions, there's secure web gateways, things like that. I just don't think necessarily any of our competitors, and I know some of them are very large competitors, and I can mention the name, but I'm not going to. I don't think. Within their own ecosystem, they have a fantastic view of it. But I think the thing that's very fortunate with us is not just our own ecosystem that we're looking at. It's actually across these 50 other vendors as well. So I think it gives us a breadth and look that is as good as anybody else's. I can think of some other large IT security vendors that I think probably have that depth of view as well. I think what differentiates Webroot is we don't only have the view of it, we're able to constantly change that view and update that view and use that in an actionable way, very, very, very quickly, almost real time in some sense. So that threat intelligence, that ability to have threat intelligence that's that current is fundamental to be able to protect people.
Okay, and then the last question that we have, and like I said, if you're listening to this and you think of other questions, go ahead and type those into the box, and we'll take care of them by email after the program. But the person asks, I've seen Webroot talking about multi-vector protection. What do you mean by that when you say multi-vector protection?
I just simply mean that there's different attack vectors, as we saw. There's things come through email, there's things come through links, there's things through malvertising. If you go to a website, there's application exploits in the browser, there's vulnerabilities because you don't update your Adobe, you don't update various things like that. They're all ways in which a hacker can actually get onto the system and compromise the system. So what you want to make sure is that you've got defenses in place that can address each of those different areas and can address those effectively. And as I said, and I'll try to conclude with, ideally you want to have as much prevention technology as well as protection technology. Protection is more when it's happening, I want to protect you, but prevention is stopping it before it can happen. And I think sometimes we sort of there's that. So it's the blend of things you've got both at the prevention and the protection layer. And then again, as was mentioned by the analysts, very much at that remediation layer as well. So you want to think it all the way through about what's the best way to. But that's what we mean by it. But I also try and build into multi-vector the fact that if you start thinking about layers, endpoint is one layer, and it should have a whole lot of different layers in it. But actually, you should look at your other technologies and what layers they have and the way they do it and understand this. I think a lot of security is I wouldn't say is bought on the wrong premise, but sometimes I think people don't understand what they bought and what they've got. And actually, even if they understood the products they had, they'd be able to improve their defenses because they'd be able to switch on things that maybe they didn't know was actually even there. So, so it's true. I think so you talk about software, and we talk about they talk about people using Word, and they say, well, you only use 5% of Word. Most people only use 5% of Word. So I think sometimes it's the same as security. You've got a lot of things there. Make sure they're turned on. Make sure you're using them. Make sure you understand it. And it's I think we were guilty. Webroot isn't sometimes just as guilty as that. We actually launched our certification program, software certification program, partner certification program for our software. And I think we launched this a month ago. I think we've had 2,300 people sign up for it. I just looked at that. There was obviously a huge desperate need for us to have something to educate people about how to use our software there. So and I said, I think that's there's some fundamental stuff. I think be careful because when you buy technology, if you're an MSP or everything, you really need to get the best out of it. We did have an unfortunate incident earlier this year, and I'm not going to delve too much into it, but I do know that the people that knew our technology and had worked with it a while and understood it actually got around that issue very rapidly without our help whatsoever. Whereas a lot of our other customers who just bought the technology and just used it as a black magic box were sort of in a lot more, had a lot more issues. It took a lot longer to recover. So it just, so that's part of it too. I think, there's a whole, that's security training, never mind security awareness training. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, that's about it, everybody. Again, thank you, George. Thanks, everybody, for listening in. In a moment, we'll be taking you to the Webroot website for more tools and information. And I'd also like to note before we go that today's channelcast and its content are copyright 2017 by the Channel Company, LLC, and its affiliates. All rights are reserved. All trademarks are the property of their respective owners. Any rebroadcast or redistribution of this channelcast or any portion thereof without the prior written consent of the Channel Company, LLC, is prohibited. And again, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's channelcast, brought to you by the Channel Company and Webroot. And also on behalf of George Anderson, our guest, and our virtual production team, thanks everybody for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.